Between 1346 and 1353, Europe was not the place to be at. Those were the years of the Black Death, the single most devastating pandemic in history. It killed people in North Africa and Asia, and it absolutely destroyed Europe. Of course, we don't have exact numbers, but we do know that up to 60% of all Europeans died from the bubonic plague, and 1/3 of Middle Easterners also died from it. The plague had such a profound effect on the continent that it kicked it out of its social order and put it on a brand new course of history. Hi, my name is Sebastian and you're watching 7 Facts. Europe in the 14th century was a very different place than it is today. The late medieval period was marked by war, famine and disease, and it was in this context that the Black Death emerged. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was the deadliest known pandemic in human history. It's estimated that it killed between 75 and 200 million people, with some estimates as high as 300 million. It's difficult to say exactly how many people died, but it's clear beyond a shadow of a doubt that the impact was devastating, with entire communities wiped out and societies changed forever. So, what in the world allowed the Black Death to spread so quickly and with such deadly consequences? In the 14th century, Europe was, despite popular belief, a highly interconnected region, with trade and commerce linking ports, towns and cities across the continent. This made it easy for the disease to spread rapidly from one place to another. In addition to this, Europe was also experiencing a period of climate change, with colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons, leading to crop failures and famine. This meant that people were already weakened and more susceptible to disease when the Black Death arrived. There's also evidence to suggest that Yersinia pestis, the bacteria causing the disease, also spread through other means, not just the infamous fleas off of rats. Throughout this video, we'll be exploring the origins of the plague, how it spread and its effects on society. We'll also be examining the ways in which people responded to this devastating pandemic and how it changed the course of history. So, sit back, try to relax, and let's dive into the world of the Black Death. The origins of the Black Death are actually shrouded in mystery, but there are many theories about where it came from. One of the most popular theories is that it originated in Asia, specifically in the region around the modern-day country of China, even more specifically around the Tian Shan Mountains on the border with Kyrgyzstan. At least that's what modern genetic analyses point to. But as to where the 14th century outbreak started, well, it could be anywhere between China and Central Asia to the Middle East. No matter where it started, the first reports of the plague came during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea. The port was surrounded in 1347 by the Golden Horde army of Yanibeg, who decided to do a bit of biological warfare. He threw the bodies of Mongol warriors who had already died of the plague over the walls of the besieged city. Problem was that Kaffa, like any other town and city, had a lot of rats, and those rats had fleas and neither avoided corpses. So when the Genoese ships of Kaffa sailed away, flea-infested black rats came with them, and so did the plague. The outbreak reached Europe in Crimea, but it spread from Constantinople, Sicily, and Italy, from where it rapidly spread to the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, and Western Asia. Today we have evidence to show that once it came ashore, the Black Death mainly spread person to person as pneumonic plague, thus explaining the quick inland spread of the epidemic. The symptoms of the Black Death were gruesome and included painful swelling of the lymph nodes, fever, and chills. 1 to 7 days after exposure to the bacteria, flu-like symptoms develop, symptoms like fever, migraines, and vomiting. Soon after, the lymph nodes closest to where the bacteria entered the skin swell and become painful. Those are the buboes, and they sometimes may break open from the swelling. Acral necrosis, the dark discoloration of skin, occurs when blood supply is disrupted for prolonged periods, blackening and damaging the affected area and surrounding tissues. This very painful symptom is where the term Black Death comes from. Victims could die within days of contracting the disease, and mortality rates were estimated to be between 30% and 95%. It was the beginning of a horrible pandemic that would change the world forever. So, Yersinia pestis began its conquest somewhere in Asia. It made its way to Crimea and from there to Italy. As the plague spread across the peninsula, it soon made its way into the rest of Europe. The very thing that made Europe function also condemned it. The disease traveled along trade routes on sea and land, infecting people as it went. Within just a few years, it had spread as far north as Scandinavia and as far east as Russia. There were several factors that allowed the disease to spread so quickly. One was poor hygiene. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages weren't filthy and unaware of cleanliness, but compared to modern standards, people indeed bathed rarely and didn't wash their clothes as often. In this case, not washing your clothes proved to be a death sentence. But another factor was overcrowding, as people often lived in cramped and unsanitary conditions. These two factors joined as one. By the 14th century, urban Europe was filthy as hell, with human waste on streets, live animals and their waste on the same streets, plus blood and runoff from local slaughterhouses. All this to say that rats and transmissible diseases had near-perfect conditions to spread in the overcrowded towns and cities of Europe. And with no effective medical treatment available, the plague was able to infect and kill millions upon millions of people. The social and economic effects of the Black Death were devastating, and it's actually hard to fully comprehend just how terrible this pandemic was. I mean, there were literally entire communities that were wiped out. Death was everywhere. And this had a profound impact on European society. One of the most significant changes was the breakdown of feudalism, which was the social and economic system that had dominated Europe for centuries. The feudal system was based on the idea of lords and vassals, with the lords owning lands and the vassals working it. But with so many people dying from the plague, there were not enough workers to farm the land. As a result, many lords were forced to offer better working conditions and wages to attract workers. The plague also caused a disruption of trade, as many of the merchants who traveled along the trade routes were infected and died. This led to a shortage of goods, which caused prices to rise, and that turned into rampant inflation. Many people lost their jobs and were forced to turn to begging or crime to survive. So, from the Black Plague, a new world rose, one with a weakened Catholic Church, a more powerful working class, and a new set of ideas that marked the transition between the Middle Ages and modernity. Today we call it the Renaissance. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, there's still a lot to talk about. The Black Death had a profound impact on European society in the 14th century, that much we established. The social order that had existed for centuries was thrown into chaos as the disease swept across the continent, killing tens of millions of people. As a result, the way people lived, worked, and worshipped underwent significant changes. One more way society changed was through the rise of religious extremism. Many people turned to extreme forms of religious expression, such as flagellants who whipped themselves in public displays of piety, or individuals who blamed the Jews and the Gypsies for the plague and initiated violent attacks against them. The breakdown of social norms also occurred during this time. As fear and desperation took hold, people began to abandon their responsibilities to family and community, leading to a breakdown of social structures. Lawlessness and violence became rampant, and that too led to the breakdown of the traditional feudal system of nobles and peasants. And the medical community was also deeply affected by the plague. There was, of course, no clear understanding of how the disease was transmitted or how to effectively treat it. Doctors and other medical professionals tried a variety of treatments ranging from bloodletting to herbal remedies, but none were effective in curing or preventing the disease. By the way, those iconic beaks doctors wore were not some symbolic costume. Plague doctors wore a special costume consisting of an ankle-length overcoat and a bird-like beak mask in an attempt to purify the air they breathed. That beak held herbs and spices like lavender. This was because of a long-held belief that sickness can be spread through bad odors called miasma. Anyway, we know that much of the treatments doctors used were useless, but despite their limited knowledge, the medical community did play a role in responding to the plague. They attempted to control the spread of the disease by isolating those who were infected and implementing measures such as quarantine. These efforts were largely ineffective in stopping the spread of the disease because it was basically too little, too late. The Black Death affected people from all walks of life, but its impact was felt differently depending on one's social class. While nobles could often isolate themselves from the disease, peasants were hit particularly hard due to their close proximity to one another and poor living conditions. The clergy also suffered significant losses as they were often called upon to administer last rites to the dying. Now, you can understand how the Black Death brought about significant social and medical changes in Europe, and how in just a decade it forever changed the way people lived and worked. Many artists and writers were also deeply affected by the widespread suffering and death caused by the plague, and this was reflected in their work. One of the key themes in art and literature during this time period was the inevitability of death. Death was a constant presence in people's lives during the plague years, and we can see this presence in the art and literature of the time. For instance, the famous painting The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel the Elder depicts a landscape overrun by death and decay, with skeletons and corpses scattered throughout. Another theme that emerged during the plague years was the fragility of human life. The suddenness and unpredictability of the plague made people acutely aware of their own mortality. For example, the Italian poet Petrarch wrote a famous sonnet entitled The Triumph of Death, in which he reflects on the fleeting nature of human life and the inescapable conclusion of death. Other examples of art and literature from the period that reflects these themes include the macabre illustrations in the medieval manuscript The Dance of Death and the religious art of the time, which often depicted scenes of death and judgment. The plague forced people to confront the reality of death in a way that had not been seen before. And it's speculated that, at least in part, this type of thinking was a catalyst for the Renaissance. The resulting familiarity with death caused thinkers to dwell more on their lives on Earth rather than on spirituality and the afterlife. It also prompted a new wave of piety manifested in the sponsorship of religious works of art. While this alone doesn't justify the appearance of the Renaissance, it certainly helped. The Black Death really screwed up society as a whole, but once it was over, that society and its economy had to recover from the utter devastation caused by the plague. As the number of cases began to decline, Europe slowly began to rebuild. However, the population had been greatly reduced, and it took several generations for that population to recover to pre-plague levels, in some cases more than 4 centuries. But one of the most significant long-term effects of the plague was the rise of the middle class. With so many workers lost to the disease, there was a severe shortage of labor. This led to higher wages for the surviving workers and a rise in the standard of living for the middle class. At the same time, with so many lords and nobles dying from the disease, their estates and properties were often left without heirs. This led to a decline in the power of the feudal nobility and a rise in the power of monarchs and other more centralized authorities. The decline of feudalism was inevitable at this point. The plague also had a profound impact on future outbreaks of disease. The concept of quarantine was developed during the plague years as a way to contain the spread of a disease. This practice proved to be effective in controlling outbreaks in the centuries that followed. Finally, the search for effective medical treatments continued long after the plague had ended. The Black Death had made it clear that the medical knowledge of the time was inadequate, and efforts were made to improve medical knowledge and develop more effective treatments for disease. By any measure, the Black Death was a pivotal event in European history. Its impact was felt for centuries after the disease had run its course, and its legacy is still felt today, not just in the way we think, work, and live, but even in the way we deal with outbreaks. When the Black Death ended, around 1353, the world was a different place. Earth's global population dropped from 475 million to about 350 million. Some cities were particularly hard hit, like Cairo for instance, where 200,000 out of a total of 600,000 people died in just a few years. There's basically no other event in history that comes even close to this level of devastation. But the disease didn't disappear after the initial outbreak. In fact, there were several subsequent epidemics that followed in the centuries to come, some of which were almost as deadly as the original, although none were as widespread. One such outbreak occurred in the late 16th century when the plague ravaged cities across Europe, killing an estimated 10 million people. Another outbreak occurred in the 17th century, which claimed the lives of nearly a quarter of the population of London. Today, the plague still exists in some parts of the world, particularly in Africa. In recent years, there have been outbreaks in Madagascar, Congo, but also Peru, India, or China, causing concern among health officials. To prevent the spread of the disease, modern public health measures include quarantining patients, using protective gear, and disinfecting contaminated areas. However, despite these measures, the risk of a widespread outbreak of the plague still exists, particularly in areas with poor sanitation and high levels of poverty. While the plague can be treated with antibiotics if caught early enough, it remains a dangerous disease with a mortality rate of around 10 to 15% with treatment and up to 90% if left untreated. So, even today, if you find yourself in an area where there's a plague outbreak, my advice is run. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.